Hi, let's talk religion. So, as some of you know, I'm a student of religions, but my area of expertise is in fact Islam and Sufism. And now, what is Sufism, you may ask? And that's a very good question. I think when a lot of people think Sufism, they get this image. And technically, yes, that is Sufism, but it's in fact a very specific ritual by a specific order of Sufism called the Mevleviya that's based in Turkey. And Sufism is in fact much bigger and more complex than this, and is a much more significant part of Islamic history than many tend to believe. Now, many people tend to describe Sufism as the inner dimension of Islam, or Islamic mysticism, or associated with ascetic individuals living in caves in seclusion in the wilderness. But this, in fact, is a great oversimplification of the subject, and Sufism is a tradition that has taken on many forms, and diverse forms throughout history. To explain it properly, we'll have to go way back, all the way back, to the very inception of the Islamic religion and the immediate aftermath after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. In the years following his death, and as the Islamic religion was spreading throughout the world, many people struggled with how to apply the new religion and answer questions like what it is and how it should be lived. And in this early phase, a lot of different traditions emerged. One was the legal tradition known as fiqh, which established the diverse legal system we know today as Sharia, that thing that everyone's so afraid of. And this was a way to establish the right way to live as Muslim people and as a society. Two other traditions that emerged were theology or kalam, and also philosophy or falsafa, which was inspired by Greek philosophy and tried to apply a lot of those ideas to the written sources of the Quran and the Hadith. And lastly, there was Sufism, known in Arabic as tasawwuf. It's difficult to know exactly when Sufism appeared, but we know that in the 8th and 9th centuries, the word Sufi was used to describe a certain group of individuals in and around Baghdad that lived extremely pious and ascetic lives and would often wear very cheap and simple clothing. In fact, many believe that the word Sufi comes from the Arabic word suf, which means wool, and referred to the kind of clothing that they would wear at the time. Now, it's important to note that these different traditions were in no way exclusive. Being a Sufi did not mean that you rejected Sharia or wasn't interested in philosophy, but these tended to blend together and was all sort of part of the early Islamic history. Also, Sufism should definitely not be described as a branch of Islam, as like Sunni or Shia, because Sufis throughout history has belonged to both of these denominations. Now, these early ascetic individuals would lay the groundwork for what would become a hugely diverse and influential tradition within Islam. One of the most famous of these early Sufis was in fact a woman named Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, or Rabi'a al-Basra, and she's often described as a very beautiful woman who turned her back completely on the world and spent all her time in devotion and love for God. Now, this focus on unconditional love would later become a staple of Sufism, at least some branches within Sufism, and it is perhaps best expressed in one of her famous sayings. If I adore you out of fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I adore you out of desire for paradise, lock me out of paradise. But if I adore you for yourself alone, do not deny me your eternal beauty. Now, these early Sufis eventually evolved in different directions and are sometimes divided into two very general categories, which is sober Sufis and ecstatic Sufis. A very famous of the latter is a man by the name of Mansur al-Hallaj, who was a very controversial figure both during his lifetime but also to some degree still today. In a very popular story, it is said that Hallaj, after intense spiritual practice, entered an ecstatic state where he ran out on the streets of Baghdad shouting Ana al-Haq, which is usually translated to I am the truth. Now, truth, or al-Haq, is in fact one of the so-called 99 names of God, and thus what Hallaj was essentially saying is I am God. This, of course, shocked the authorities at the time, who executed him in a rather nasty way for daring to associate himself with God. But according to many Sufis, what he was doing was actually quite the opposite. What Hallaj had done through his intense spiritual practice was to completely annihilate himself and become immersed in the reality of God. When he said Ana al-Haq, or I am the truth, he wasn't associating himself with God, but he had taken the I out of the picture completely, and there was only God left. This, to Sufis, was in fact the ultimate sign of humility, and which is quite the opposite of what the authorities thought, and this was also become a main tenet of their practice. It's kind of similar to the philosophy that Jim Carrey is obnoxiously trying to convey in every single interview nowadays. In spite of its great diversity, especially later on, there were a few unifying practices and teachings that can be said to characterize Sufism generally. One of these is referred to as jihad al-nafs, or struggle against the self. Now, the nafs is a complex word that is usually translated to everything from ego to self or lower self. It's the part of us that we usually identify with, the I, or the me, so to speak. According to Sufis, the nafs is actually a veil that separates us from God, and thus it should be tamed and eventually taken out of the equation completely. The goal here is complete annihilation of the self, or nafs, known as fana, in which the veil is lifted and reality, as it is revealed. What this actually means is a debate that's been discussed throughout history, and there are a lot of different people who have very different opinions about it. But this also leads us to another unifying characteristic of Sufism, which is practice. How is this fana achieved? The most common practice is something known as dhikr, meaning remembrance. You've probably seen videos of dhikr with added dance music on top, as it often involves very intense bodily movements. Dhikr is a kind of meditation where the names of God, or the first half of the Shahada, there is no God but God, is repeated over and over again for long periods of time. There are kinds of dhikr that are very intense and physical, there are those that are very melodic, and also those like that of the Naqshbandiya order that is completely quiet. What they all have in common is the intent, which is remembrance of God, and thus also forgetfulness of the self, or the nafs. Another famous practice is something known as sama, which means listening. And these rituals often include music or recitation of poetry or the Quran, and has kind of a similar function to the dhikr. But here, ecstatic states are reached through listening to these things, music or recitation. Famous examples of sama include the whirling dervishes of the Mevleviya that I mentioned in the beginning, and also Qawwali music made famous by people like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. As Sufism grew in popularity, it started to eventually become more systematized, both its teachings and its practices. Around the turn of the first millennium, Sufism can be said to have taken the form that, to some degree, it still holds today. And this was mainly for two reasons. One was the intellectual systematizations of its teachings and wider acceptance as a result, brought on by people like Abu Talib al-Makis, Abu Abd al-Rahman al-Sulami, and perhaps most famously Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. It's not really historically correct to say that there existed a Muslim orthodoxy that was in opposition to Sufism, but Al-Ghazali certainly was one of the main factors in Sufism's wider acceptance throughout the Muslim world. In his book, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, he said to have successfully created a synthesis between Sufism, fiqh or jurisprudence, and Kalam-based theology, and which resulted in its, like I said, the wider acceptance. Also around this time, the practitioners of Sufism began to organize themselves into tariqas, or orders. Tariqa means way, basically, or path. Many of these orders still remain today and can differ dramatically in terms of practice or philosophy. Some of the earliest and most famous of these include the Qadariya, Shadiliya, Naqshbandiya, Rafaiya, and so on. All of these orders usually formed around a sheikh or a saint, which they call in Arabic wali, or friend of God, more properly translated, and the teachings that he is associated with. So the Qadariya was formed around a man named Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, and the Shadiliya around Abu Hassan al-Shadili, for example. And the veneration of these saints is also a great characteristic of Sufism generally, and their gravesites or shrines often become a place of pilgrimage. It is thought that these saints possess a kind of divine grace called barakah, which can be received by just being close to him while he's still alive, or after he's dead by his gravesite or shrine, as that shrine still possesses some of that barakah. The teachings and barakah of these saints is also passed down in a line of succession called silsila, which is why the idea of the sheikh is so important in Sufism. Generally speaking, if you are practicing Sufi, you need a sheikh, a spiritual master who will guide you on the path. His legitimacy is based on the line of succession that usually goes all the way back to the founder of the order and eventually also to the Prophet Muhammad himself. There's a whole lot to talk about when it comes to Sufism, and it all can't just fit into one episode, as that episode would become way too long. So we're gonna have to divide this into 2 episodes. So I'm gonna end this one here, and I'll release the next one next week. So I'll see you then.